So I was just watching a debate between Kyle Kulinski from Secular Talk and Jesse Lee Peterson, who hosts the Jesse Lee Peterson Show and The Fallen State. The Fallen State is, of course, his YouTube show, but this debate happened on the radio show, the Jesse Lee Peterson Show, which is available on Newsmax. Now, it was an interesting debate. I made one response podcast to Jesse Lee Peterson debating David Pakman, and that was still at a time when I thought that Jesse Lee Peterson was much more, what's the word, like real than he really than he actually is. Okay. No, he's definitely a growing YouTube star. He's going to get a lot more famous over the next 12 months. At the time of this recording, November 2018. But what I would say about Jesse Lee Peterson is that he's someone that you really have to read between the lines with. Like, he actually has a message. A lot of people just look at him and think that he's some crazy guy, that he's some crazy Alabama conservative, but you really have to read between the lines, because there actually is a message in what he's saying. And Kyle Kulinski is Kyle Kulinski. Everybody knows him very well. He definitely has a larger YouTube following. But, one of the things that they, well, it's actually two things that they had in the debate. You know, the name Secular Talk talks about religion and politics, belief systems and politics. Let's talk about a few of the political things first. As someone who's been watching a lot more Jesse Lee Peterson recently, I definitely was kind of very hesitant to some things that Kyle said that, such as, I would really question his understanding of the social safety net. I mean, a lot of people on both sides of the aisle believe that certain things from the social safety net should never be on the table for discussion. Like, you should never be cutting certain things. Like, we had the whole debacle with CHIP, the child health insurance program, as well as even certain things, such as WIC, women, infant, children. Like, those budgets, they should never be cut. Absolutely not. The entitlements should not be cut. But, what Kyle did was he tried to tie the social safety net into people who just simply made bad decisions. And Jesse Lee Peterson called him out on this when he's just like, you're talking about people who just made bad decisions and were just overspending outside of their budget. And furthermore, what I believe Peterson was about to say but got interrupted is, they're talking about the concept of the minimum wage, where it's like, if somebody's working full-time for $7.25 an hour, that's a bad setup, and that person needs to try and get another job as soon as possible. Whereas also what I believe Peterson was sort of alluding to is the concept of having children when you aren't able to take care of them and provide for them. So what Peterson's trying to argue is that this is a decision-making process, and what you can't do is sort of foster these kind of bad decisions, such as, because there are certain things within the social safety net that just shouldn't be touched because people depend on them for life. But Kyle is kind of expanding that into things about people who just sort of made irresponsible decisions with money and then they want the government to pick them up. And that's one of the reasons, why so many people were critical of the system. They're just like, it's supposed to be a social safety net, not an escape rope. Furthermore, Jesse Peterson also challenged him on something where he was like, nobody should be, working a full-time job and ending up in poverty. And I don't know about you, but I know zero people actually that work minimum wage for 40 hours a week. That is a big cultural thing that we do have to recognize in the United States of America. Minimum wage jobs aren't for people who are supporting families. Like, you should never be a cashier at McDonald's and try to support a family with that. Minimum wage jobs are for high school students looking for after-school jobs, or perhaps, other social groups that are in the lower, kind of smaller demographics, like perhaps senior citizens who just want extra money or just something to keep them occupied. But it's like, you should not be trying to work a minimum wage job to support a family. No, absolutely not. Moreover, once again, most minimum wage jobs, almost all minimum wage jobs don't give 40 hours a week. They don't give any sort of full-time anything. You should be focusing your job search somewhere else. And Jesse Lee Peterson really tried to draw attention to that. Okay, well, that's some praise for him. Now, talking about some criticisms, they really got into some of the religious things, and I thought Kyle was very, very prompt at responding to a lot of the religious challenges. But these two guys come at things from very different perspectives. Like, you know, Jesse Lee Peterson asked him, "Where do you get your values and your morals from?" or something to that effect, and Kyle just simply replied, he's like, "Logic, reason, and human empathy, the golden rule." Pretty good response, But the big thing to remember with Jesse Lee Peterson is that he has a very different kind of spirituality. He is a reverend, and he has a group called the Brotherhood of the New Destiny, otherwise known as Bond. And it's like, he has a very different view of spirituality. It's like when he uses certain terms, they mean different things. Like, for him, love just means the lack of hatred. And also, it's like, he's even said on one of his episodes of The Fallen State that you don't have to read the Bible. The Bible's written on your heart. And also, just the entire concept of emotions. Like, the reason why Peterson is saying that emotions are, like beta male stuff is because if you have achieved a level of inner peace, then you aren't going to have the fluctuations in emotions. The emotions that you have, like being like the intense happiness and sadness, what Kyle called it, like the peaks and the valleys or something, the intense emotions of happiness and sadness are the result of environment and surroundings. That's just the material things around you. If you have achieved a level of inner peace, you won't be feeling that way. I mean, like, so Jesse Lee Peterson has his own very kind of unique form of spirituality. I say unique because I've never heard anyone ever address that. Now, during the debate, I really thought Peterson didn't present some things very well regarding the concepts of racism, and, many people have just flat out accused him of trolling with this stuff, and I've come to the conclusion that, yeah, Jesse Lee Peterson is mostly trolling, but he's not saying things that he doesn't believe. What he is doing is kind of taking what he believes and sort of exaggerating. He's saying it in a very bizarre and awkward manner. He's exaggerating the personality but keeping the information intact. So he's saying what he does honestly feel. It's just he says it in such a bizarre and awkward manner. It really just comes across as very weird. But, like, he's using things in such weird terms, and Kyle's calling him out every single time. He's like, "Well, the Ku Klux Klan, you're saying that they aren't racist?" He's like, "No, but do they hate black people?" "Yes, but they hate black people, that's the problem." It was very awkward at that time, and it was also just not the best presentation, because as someone who's listened to Jesse Lee Peterson regularly, I know what he's talking about. He's addressed this issue before, that it's the hatred that is the variable. It has nothing to do with race, because you can hate somebody for a variety of reasons. So it's like, and he says this in the debate, but Kyle didn't. Kyle's, coming at this from a more conventional standpoint, the way we would traditionally use the words like racism. But what Jesse Lee Peterson simply means is that people like the Ku Klux Klan or even Louis Farrakhan was like, they hate somebody. The problem is the hatred. That's what the problem is. It has nothing to do with race. Jesse Lee Peterson is also someone who does not identify as African American. He only identifies as American. Peterson has also gone as far to say that slavery was not about racism, because blacks can enslave other blacks. The Arabs were also participants in the slave trade. It's like, well, and also whites can enslave other whites. It's like any race can exist, independent of slavery. Or I should say slavery can exist regardless of race, irregardless. It doesn't really matter what someone's race is. Anyone can be susceptible to slavery. And we really see that in the 21st century. All these new examples of modern-day slavery that still have never been healed, that have never, been corrected. But when we want to look at this in terms of the debate that they were having, Peterson's sort of worldview is that because slavery can exist beyond racial boundaries, that is an issue about things that are associated with economics, and it's about profiting off of someone else's labor and not paying them for it. And a white person can enslave a white person, a black person can enslave a black person. Race is not the variable associated with slavery. Slavery is about profiting off of someone's labor without paying them for it. And yes, I'm drawing off of his previous segments on his radio show and on The Fallen State. But during the debate, I really think Kyle had the upper edge with that stuff, because once again, he's just sort of like, yeah, okay, but all right, but they still hate black people, and they're still they still think that black people are an inferior form of life. I mean, we're talking about the Klan still. The Klan, or Louis Farrakhan, maybe he hates the Jews and he thinks the Jews are inferior to blacks. Okay, he's still a racist. I mean, racism still exists. So, I mean, it's sort of like two guys that are just battling over a perspective thing, like where, Jesse Lee Peterson's like saying the glass is half empty, and Kyle's like, no, it's not, it's half full. And then Peterson's like, yeah, but the top half has no water in it. And then Kyle's like, but the bottom half does. It was sort of like a very much like that. And this is purely for entertainment, I'm totally well aware. I just really thought that the reason I decided to compose a response was I felt that Jesse Peterson's kind of worldview wasn't really well presented in something like this, partially because Kyle is actually someone who can respond very quickly to these sort of challenges, whereas most people who appear on the Fallen State really were not prepared in the past for Jesse Lee Peterson's line of questioning about his kind of repetitive, demanding the people respond to only his questions and very simple answers, and they just don't really know how to do that. And I've noticed that many people who debate Jesse Peterson are ones who have very long drawn out, very kind of open, very abstract feelings about things. Like when they ask you, what is a man? What is love? Where do you get your values from? I mean, they like to give very creative, open, and thoughtful responses, but he doesn't really want that. He's really just trying to highlight you aren't getting to the heart of the issue by elaborating on stuff and spinning circles. But Kyle isn't somebody like that. Kyle can actually give very precise answers, and we gave a good example of that. If you're an atheist, where do you get your values from? And he said logic, facts, and reason, as well as basic human empathy. So that was something that was rather interesting. But no, it's like, what I've really come to the conclusion is, though, that Jesse Lee Peterson does have a unique spiritual presence. Like, he still identifies as a reverend, even though he says stuff like, you don't have to read the Bible, it's written on your heart. So I've never really heard anyone present things in that particular manner. But, it's like, it's just something to always bear in mind when you're listening to him, is that he actually does have a spiritual message. It's just, he doesn't say it very directly. For starters, I mean, I think a lot of people do that. A lot of people hold back information, or they hold back things that they do genuinely want to share, because they want to present it in a very slow and gradual manner so that people will be pulled in, and it will be more inviting to people once they become familiar. Rush Limbaugh even talked about this. He openly admitted that he did that with his radio show when he was starting out. He talked about this back in the 90s when he's like, if you were to just jump in on the first day listening, you'd be like, what the hell is this? Like, it would be kind of off-putting for a variety of people. But if you slowly listen to something gradually, then you can start to understand what the person's point of view is. However, I thought it was an interesting thing to hear about the Justice Democrats from Kyle, who is a founding member of the Justice Democrats. And one of the things that the Democratic Party just needs to recognize, and they really could have done the whole debate on this, maybe it's a debate for a different program, but what is going to be the future of the Democratic Party? Because, Progressive Voice was putting out a poll where they were just asking, like, should the Democrats and the Justice Democrats split into two factions or split into two different parties? I mean, one of the things that we could really recognize is that the Justice Democrats could just be the future, because as Kyle has described, it's left populism, so why not go with that as opposed to this kind of mainstream oligarch system that they have, where you have Democrats like Joe Manchin, whom the party doesn't really want. He just snuck in through the primaries, as well as, just a variety of other individuals, who are just like causing a lot of trouble. Even someone such as Maxine Waters, or perhaps Representative Hank Johnson from Georgia's 4th Congressional District. Yeah, okay. But I actually did think it was really nice to hear that Kyle spoke very highly of Barbara Lee and wanted her to be Speaker of the House. I mean, I personally think Barbara Lee should have been the 2016 nominee for the Democrats. I'm not a Democrat myself, but it's like, as Kyle just sort of explained, she was the only person of both houses of Congress to vote against the Afghan war. She supported the cabinet-level Department of Peace. Kyle's just like, she has good foresight, And that's very important when it comes to leadership. The problem is, though, with about becoming Speaker of the House and replacing Nancy Pelosi, as far as I understand, she does not want to. She just wanted to be the chair of the Progressive Caucus, or one of those. But it's like Kyle and I are in somewhat agreement on that. I would just sort of say that I really thought Jesse Lee Peterson could have expanded a lot during the sort of spiritual side of the debate, because he definitely had a lot of spiritual things that he was believing, but he just wasn't saying them. And then part of the reason for that is just that, once again, he has a very unique spirituality, so if he just would just put it out there in this debate with Kyle that's going to be shared on Kyle's YouTube page, where I watched it on Secular Talk, a lot of people wouldn't have understood what he was saying, that, very simply, love is the absence of hate and things like that. But they also asked the question, what is a man? Every time you watch The Fallen State, Jesse Peterson's like, what is a man? And I'm always just like, why don't people just say what Kyle did? It's like, it's a male who's an adult. He's like, yeah, but is our male and a man the same thing? It's a male who is an adult. And I was like, why don't people just say that on Jesse Lee Peterson's show? He always asks that same question. It's a male who's 18 years and older. And it's like, Peterson, though, does have some sort of spirituality, though. I know I keep sort of sounding like a broken record on that, but his stuff is about inner peace. That's the really thing that I wanted to stress. He has a view of Christianity that is very connected to inner peace. And he's sort of saying that all of these things, like the massive emotional changes that people have in life, are kind of holding people back, actually. They're actually holding you back. Those things are sort of responding poorly to your environment. And he might even genuinely believe that liberalism is something that is responding poorly to one's environment and surroundings. It's making people very emotional, but I don't believe that personally, but he might, Jesse Lee Peterson might. I'm just interpreting the evidence. But I just think it's kind of always fascinating to hear different points of view about the concept of spirituality and kind of what different people think. So when you have somebody who's saying that, you don't have to read the Bible, it's written on your heart, it's more just like, not only is it go with your conscience, Peterson does believe in God. He does say that very clearly. He does find that, there is a message that is guiding him, and it's also about overcoming these barriers in life, and the way you do that is you promote a message of love. Love is just not hate. If you don't hate something, that means that you love it, so that's how you love all people. He always asked everybody, do you love black people? Do you love white people? And he wants the answer to be yes, because love is just not hate. If you don't hate any of the other social groups, that means that you love them, and that's how you eradicate racism, is by promoting this message of love. And the way that you promote sort of things that are going to make society stronger are by accepting individual responsibility. He wrote a whole book about this called From Rage to Responsibility, as well as The Antidote, where these things are discussed a little bit more thoroughly. But it's like, he loads his platform with a bunch of things where he's like, blacks were better under Jim Crow, and I actually really wanted to do an entire segment on that, about the sort of kind of secret meanings in his platform. And I would say one of that is like, Jesse Lee Peterson actually grew up with a cleft palate that wasn't corrected until he was in his teen years. And I think one of the reasons why he says that blacks were better off under Jim Crow is probably because he was on a plantation, and part of his duties were working with the animals, slaughtering pigs and such. And one of the reasons I think he says that blacks are better off under Jim Crow is that perhaps he didn't like to go out and socialize because he had a cleft palate, and he always wears a beard and goatee, mustache, whatever you'd like to call it these days, but it was corrected in his teen years. But it's like, he probably found more solace and comfort being on the plantation, the farm life, people who recognized him, and he probably grew up in a way where he just found that particular way of life was more welcoming than the outside world, which would have looked down upon him solely because of his appearance, as well as, when you're working with things like the animals, they will, of course, never judge you for anything. But he actually does have an argument about that. He says that blacks were separate, but they were separate from whites, but they were more involved with society. Obviously, that's not really anything that we can entertain on any serious level. I think there's just kind of a deeper psychological root related to his own story, where he's projecting himself onto the entirety of the black populations, what Kyle Kulinski called the monolith, like you're referring to black people as a monolith. But I really do think that that could be a very large factor in his thought process, when he's just like, he had a bit of a facial deformity growing up, so it was more comfortable for him to live on the plantation, and that was something that he viewed as kind of welcoming, and also home, and going out into the outside world was something that was not as welcoming. So, and it was also probably people who caused a lot of conflict and weird looks, and even frightening in some ways. So that's why he always has this idea that the plantation is a good thing, and that it was good to grow up on a plantation. And it's a very attractive message for people who want to exploit that stuff. But once again, though, I do insist, though, Jesse Lee Peterson is sharing a message about spirituality that is very unique. You just have to read between the lines. Kyle Kulinski is very clear about his non-belief. And of course, in terms of liberalism, progressivism, social democrat, justice democrat, Kyle is 100% clear, and I definitely think that Kyle is just trying not to laugh too much during the debate, because he knows that Jesse Lee Peterson is a very exaggerated character, and it's just something for the fans, really. It's just something for the fans to hear people discuss issues, and I just wanted to do this little response to say we can read between the lines, and it's a fairly entertaining discussion.